China released its 14th five-year plan proposal on October the 29th after the fifth plenum of the 19th CPC Central Committee convened in Beijing, where the communique proposes major social and economic development targets for this country in the next 5 years. So how significant is the five-year model for China? Do the dual circulation and the innovation-driven core national strategy mean that China will take an inward turn? And how will China take the lead for the world economy? To talk about these issues and more, I'm joined today by Professor John Gong from the University of International Business and Economics, David Mahon, Executive Chairman of Mahon China Investment Management, Fraser Cameron, Director of the EU Asia Center in Brussels, and later Anthony Chan, former JP Morgan Chase Chief Economist. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. China's economic plan. This is the five-year plan. Actually, John, the model was established in 1953. Right. That means China has been planning its economy 14 times consecutively for over the past 70 years. Right. But do you think making planning now is different from, say, 70 years ago?
Well, I think the practice has been maintained over so many years, but I think the difference really lies within the difference in our economic system. It used to be a 100% Soviet-style planned economy. So everything is done according to this plan. Everything is done to the details of this plan, right? But now this is more of sort of a policy initiative. It's for guiding principles, and there's some policy instruments behind this plan. But I think the difference really lies in a different kind of economic system that it rests upon. We are now what's called a socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics. We still have a fairly large government role. We still have a fairly strong government in terms of steering and leading economic activities. We still have a quite large sector of state-owned enterprises. So these plans are still very useful and are still quite weighty, I would say, in our economic lives. I think that's probably the major difference. But that certainly it has played its role, and it's also continue to play that very important role in terms of leading our economy into the next step.
And Davey, there is another difference probably, that is the context, because 60 years ago, China's economy was insignificant at all, but now it is the #2 economy and the first among world economies to recover after COVID. So how different is the context right now?
I think the difference is that in the old days, or if you go back in the years before economic reform, there was a compliance to the five-year plan, or attempts to comply. And it was in a very restricted framework. Whereas now it's more of a genuine goal setting. And the risks of doing so, the challenges of doing so are far greater, because the market forces of China are free, they're spontaneous, and effectively the government has to read the trends and then to some extent adapt the plans to the realities of the trends. And it gives China an advantage. If you think of the current situation globally, very few Western countries are forecasting or setting economic visions. They're dealing with quarter by quarter or year by year aims. And that's something that really sets China apart. We're largely driven by short election cycles and companies, particularly listed companies, delivering quarterly or yearly returns to shareholders. These set the trends for the economy in a very short-term manner. So China has the benefit of looking further and planning over long periods of time for things to truly unfold and evolve.
And Fraser, what is your understanding about the Chinese planning for economy? Of course, Western countries also have plans economically. For example, Biden said, build back America. There was a Marshall Plan in the 1950s to build Europe. But what is the difference of the Chinese plan?
Well, it varies. There's no single Western concept. If you look, for example, at Germany, they, over decades now, have achieved a consensus to what they call the social market economy. And that has basically been accepted by all parties, and you've seen very good results from that. in America and in the UK, it's more short-termism, as David was saying. So people are looking for short-term results to satisfy their shareholders and also to ensure that they boost the economy to win the next election. And of course, sometimes unfortunate things happen, as you see in America just now. Trump had hoped to win the election on the back of economic performance and the rising stock market, and then COVID intervened. So things can go wrong. So I don't think one system is better than the other. There are differences to the system and each of their strengths and their weaknesses.
And what is your assessment of the track record of China delivering on those plans, Fraser?
Well, it's pretty good. I mean, if you look at the quite astonishing development of China over the last 20, 25 years, I mean, it's outgrown nearly all other economies, lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and developed some cutting-edge new technology. And now I think their priorities going forward in terms of green economy and innovation are the right ones. So I think the track record's pretty good.
John?
Well, I want to add a note about the differences between China's economic planning versus what's happening, for example, in Washington, D.C. I think, at least I see two differences. One is that in the U.S., it's more of sort of a vision statement in a very narrow selective areas, emphasis, for example. We may pick, for example, infrastructure, right, building for the next 3 or 4 years, or tax cutting, right? I mean, there's a few set of very narrowly defined goals. What I say in China, it's very comprehensive. I mean, look at the different areas that this plan has been covering.
It's more a systematic plan.
It's a systematic and very comprehensive plan. I think that's the first difference. The second difference is that typically in our plan, we have real policy initiatives behind this plan. And I would say you have to really read into almost every sentence that, these sentences are not crafted or drafted without careful planning. There's a story behind it, and typically there's policy instruments behind it. In other words, there's money behind it. Government spending, government policies tilted towards achieving these goals. Whereas in the U.S., for example, it's more of a sort of a wish. It's more of a guiding principle. It's more of a calling for investment. For example, government is the federal government is constrained by its budget, and there's not much it can do in terms of making real investment from a federal government's perspective. So I think these are very different perspectives, and I think inherent
You're
to
also implying there are different execution plans.
That's what I'm about to say. Inherent to it, I think the Chinese plan has built in its own inner mechanism that is a high likelihood of being really implemented and realized. Whereas in the U.S., I think it's more of a goal, it's a wish, something waiting to be seen. For example, President Trump has been talking about Make America Great Again. Remember in 2016, he's talking about making $1 trillion or $2 trillion of investment into making these nice bridges and highways and airports and these kind of stuff, right? I mean, after 4 years, really nothing had happened. So this is a plan that is not implemented.
He did deliver on tax cut, though.
On tax cuts, he has done it, but at least he's talking about Make America Great Again. Right? I mean, at least we have to see America great again in terms of infrastructure build out. In the middle of his term, Gary Cohn was proposing a plan of some kind, and then he resigned, he left, and then the whole infrastructure build out was just evaporates. So that's, I think, it's a huge difference.
Let's come back to China's plan. Well, the communique doesn't mention the pace of the GDP growth explicitly, but it says China's GDP per capita will match the level in moderately developed countries by 2035. So, John, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean that it will reach the per capita GDP level of which countries?
Okay. Well, it didn't really say what's the exact figure, right? Here's my guess. Okay. Right now, first let's talk about what's the China's current status.
Why didn't it specifically say what kind of target it is?
Well, I mean, think about it. 15 years away. That's a long time span, right? There's many things can happen. So it would be, in my opinion, it would be very difficult to forecast a number with a kind of a precision that people can be really comfortable about. I mean, we're talking about 15 years, but we do have a quite a close perspective. We have a real perspective here. What's the current status? China is currently only about $2,000 per capita GDP short of the highest income category in it was called a GNI system, income classification system proposed by the World Bank. So we are a little bit $2,000 short, and I think that goal could be
currently is it around
$10,000. Yeah. So I think that goal can be reached maybe within 5 to 10 years, right? So given another 5 to 10 years, according to this forecast, this planning, I would say probably this plan was talking about getting to the middle, okay, of the high income category. And let me tell you what that means. It means that in the mid, currently by 2019 standard, the middle of that category, high income category, is 2/3. One is that it's about, right now there's 60 countries, about 60 countries fit into that category. So in the middle would be like 30 some level, okay? Second, the per capita income is about $30,000, and I'll give you a few countries like that. Spain, for example, South Korea, Italy, it will be around that range, and a couple of Gulf states like Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, UAE. These are countries at that level. So my personal forecast and guess would be hopefully we'll be reaching to that country's level, these countries' level by 2035.
David, what is your projection of China's economy reaching which kind of level? And considering China has a huge population, 1.4 billion, what does it mean for the world?
Well, it means a lot of things. I think first, GDP is, in some angles, quite artificial, particularly when you look at the scale of China and the drivers of the Chinese economy, which are still related to urbanization. There's a considerable amount of people still to come and live in cities, to move away from the countryside. So those drivers are forces that other countries don't have. So I think, while I agree that you can look at comparators to try and understand what is meant by this long-term forecast, I don't think we should pay too much attention to it. It's a kind of sign of confidence that the government's no longer setting a goal, trusting that the natural forces within the Chinese marketplace will be presenting a very acceptable and a very rational GDP growth. It's quite extraordinary that China will achieve perhaps 2% growth this year, in a year when to have achieved a low negative would have been actually acceptable. So I think there are many factors. The other is that it's quite good to break China into parts. You take the 11 coastal provinces and look at the GDP growth for those provinces altogether. And then you get a very interesting indication of how the middle class is expanding. Then you look at the center of China, the west of China, and it isn't so much the per capita of income, but it's the poverty alleviation, which again is one of the aims that is implied in this 5-year plan. And interestingly, very few countries talk about having aims to alleviate poverty. China has always had that as a major driver, certainly over the last 30 years. So in a sense, GDP as a classification means different things for China. But I think it's a sign of confidence that we're no longer saddled, as we have been in previous years, with this concept that we must reach a certain percentage. So I think a more natural economic reporting process will also flow from this, and that's good.
And Fraser, what is your understanding of Chinese term of moderately prosperous society? And as we have 4 more populations than the United States, that means probably our aggregate GDP will exceed that of the U.S. by 2030.
But I tend to agree with David here. You have to treat statistics with some caution. It's firstly a question of how the country is going to produce a balanced growth. And we all know that in China so far, it's been a struggle to achieve balanced growth. So much more attention has to be paid to the lower income groups. And I think that is also outlined in the current 5-year plan. I think secondly, too, one has to try and take into account the development of international trade, because we've seen a downturn over the last couple of years, partly for political reasons, partly for the COVID reasons. And I think if we can get back to agreement amongst the major actors in terms of international trade, that will also boost growth, not only in China, but also in the United States and in Europe and elsewhere. So there are a number of internal and external factors to be taken into account when you look at how China is going to grow. And statistics don't tell the whole story.
But as you said, there are many complicating factors. International trade is uncertain. Will that take a toll on China's economic plan and execution of the plan? Fraser?
It has already taken a toll. I mean, I think achieving growth figures this year of just under 2% is quite amazing, but it could have been higher if we didn't have the trade conflict with the United States. Interestingly, the report from Brookings this week says that the United States has suffered more in terms of GDP loss, in terms of the payments that Trump has to make to farmers and so on. So both sides have lost, and this is what we know from history. People lose when there's a trade war. So we have to get back to some agreement round the table in the WTO and elsewhere about how to achieve agreed rules of procedure, because that will boost international growth. We all know that.
And David, what is your thoughts on the biggest risks for China's economy in the coming decade? What might be the thing that derail the economy?
Well, probably the one vulnerability is the extent to which China depends upon resources internationally, whether it's oil or componentry for its electronics sector. These are the things which, given a more hostile global environment and more conflict, not just with the US, but with many of its trading partners. We have to consider Australia. We also have to consider how recent overtures in Europe didn't get the results that China was looking for. So China depends a lot on the inputs in terms of driving its economy. Beyond that, though, China is largely a domestic economy. Whether or not China has a good trade account in terms of exports is no longer that significant for ongoing economic growth. It's a very unique position. Doesn't mean that China can be isolated from the rest of the world, but it does give it internal resources that very few other economies globally possess.
So you think China's dual circulation strategy is the right response? Relying on both domestic and international supply and demand?
Yeah, I mean, the dual circulation is an acknowledgement of where China has arrived as an economic entity. And I think it is misunderstood, or it is perhaps utilized at the moment, and we'll wait until we see the details next year. But it's really not about China closing off its economy. It's strengthening itself internally. And who wouldn't after such a combative year, particularly with the United States? So China's going to become more self-sufficient in areas where it cannot afford to depend on the rest of the world. But beyond that, it will still invest globally. Belt and Road will still be applied wherever China can see it will be effective. And the world will come to trade with China. The world will come to sell to China. The engine that will lift us out of the slump of COVID, just like the GFC, and China became half of world trade within a year and a half of the global financial crisis. It will be the same in the COVID recovery. So I think the interaction with the rest of the world is inevitable. And there is no question that China is going to be more open in the coming years to the global economy, not less open.
More open to the rest of the economy. Thank you, David. It seems that David also echoed the central leaders' ambition, because according to Han Wenqiu, he's the Deputy Director of the Office of Central Commission for Financial and Economic Affairs of CPC. He said the dual circulation does not mean domestic circulation, and China will continue to open up its market. Dual circulation is a move out of China's own initiative, not a forced response.
Well, absolutely. I think to some extent, expanding domestic portion of our economy is already in development on its own before this concept was proposed. For such a large continental economy. So
it's not a response to the trade war with the U.S., the COVID.
I mean, look at the share of China's exports portion as percentage of the GDP. It has been a steady decline over the years. Right now, it's about 70%. So the international piece is already shrinking as a percentage of the large economy, and it's actually quite natural. You would expect such a. I'm referring to this as a continental economy, such a large scale. And there's no way you can rely too much on its international portion to be a major driver of your economy, because that's going to cause all kinds of problems with the rest of the world. I mean, look at the large economies in the world. I mean, look at the United States. Export sector is very small, compared to its overall size, right? So this is a economic historic trend going on its own, and as you quoted, I mean, it's absolutely important that this ever-expanding domestic pie does not imply that China is going to be close to the rest of the world. On the contrary, right? We have to be precisely emphasizing the importance of opening up the economy even more. China being the largest trading nation right now needs that, and we can't just export our way to prosperity. We have to open our market. In a sense, I think the word reciprocal it makes a lot of sense, and I think that's the direction we're going. I mean, we're going to have the CIIE show. I think it's going to be next week, right? The world's largest imports show in the world. Very few countries does that. Now, regarding the potential risk you asked a few minutes ago, I have a very strong opinion on this issue. I think the major risk facing China as we move forward is not so much coming from the economic side or market side. I think it's mostly coming from the political side. I think the biggest risk, in my opinion, is that we need a peaceful environment.
You mean geopolitics?
That's right, exactly. We don't want a war in the Taiwan Strait. We don't want a war in the South China Sea, right? So these are the things that I think propose probably the largest risk to China's peaceful development. And I think it's an area that I think the government really needs to work on.
Yeah. And there is another area that confrontation is already being witnessed, that is in the tech field. So, Anthony, of course, China's innovation-driven national strategy calls for major breakthroughs in core technologies. Obviously, people would think that this is a response to Trump administration's policies on restricting tech trade with China. Do you think it is the right response, and what will be the implications?
I think it is the right response. China certainly has to make sure that it protects its security and certainly becomes self-sustainable if it becomes a little bit more challenging to adopt or to purchase the technology that it needs to continue to make progress. Remember that in this 5-year plan, it basically says that much of the reasons for the dual circulation is because of external circumstances. So that if conditions change and economies like the United States and others become more open and more cooperative, then I think that China will ease some of the concerns. But to the extent that those tensions persist, then China has to do what needs to get done in order to maintain its sustainability and certainly its security.
But nobody knows for sure what's going to be the next administration's policy on trade and tech. Do you think maybe there is a risk of overcompensating, over-preparing for tech divergence?
I don't think so. I think that the 5-year plan makes it very, very clear that all this was brought upon by external circumstances. So if external circumstances change, then the strategies that are pursued can actually change.
But that will be redundant resources and investment in this area.
Well, the investment is going to be necessary. It's not going to be detrimental, because if you start to increase investment as a percentage of GDP and you end up not needing it and you become self-sustainable anyway, that's not a negative thing. You could always reduce R&D spending later on. But right now, it is the right strategy to pursue for China.
And Fraser, what do you think that will mean for the rest of the world, including Western countries, if China become technologically self-sufficient or dependent on itself?
Well, I think all major economies are trying to become strategically self-sufficient.
But not all economies can.
Exactly. And that's why I come back to the importance of international trade. Obviously, the major economies can continue with limited trade, but I'm saying is they will boost their general prosperity by increasing trade. And I think this will change now if we have a new administration in Washington. I think China's already opening up on the financial side. You see many American financial institutions moving into China right now. I think we're on the cusp, hopefully, of a deal between China and the European Union on a new investments treaty. Mm-hmm. So I think all in all, this will complement, what is existing in terms of the strategic autonomy pursued by China, Europe, and the United States. But we cannot isolate each other.
Mm. John, you agree that we cannot be an island on our own. We have to be connected with the rest of the world. It's only how much and to what extent?
Absolutely. And we have to understand that China is becoming more like, from a corporate China's perspective, it's more becoming like corporate America. I mean, we have companies expanding overseas into many emerging markets. We have a huge interest in overseas countries. And in that regard, this country cannot be really inward looking. We need to establish a global trading network, investment network, right? So, China is going to be inevitably, irreversibly integrated into this international trading order, international economic order, and by just closing our own borders, we really inward looking without looking at the other, taking care of other interests. It's just not going to be sustainable over the long run. So I think this is a path that we have to take.
And Anthony, if we want to be more technological sophisticated, that means more investment. And some even predict that China will target a higher R&D investment, possibly 3% of GDP by 2025. What is your estimate of the viability of this, and where will the money come from?
I think the money could just come from other areas. Remember that in China, the government often provides signals, sometimes even tax credits, to encourage investment in different areas, a similar way that a lot of investment took place in infrastructure. So I think that if conditions continue to implore China to move in that direction, the R&D spending could go to 3% or even higher as a percentage of GDP. I think it's the right thing. Of course, to have the two largest economies in the world not cooperating is certainly not an optimal strategy. But in the reality, if you're in an optimal environment, you have to act accordingly. Yeah. The best of all possible worlds would be for all the large economies around the world, whether it be Europe, whether it be the US or China, to work together. But if that's not the case, you have to adjust.
And do you see that China will become a technological power by the end of the decade? And what would that mean?
I think it's very positive because it'll mean that increased productivity will occur, increased standard of living, just like China was able to make sufficient progress lifting over 50 million people out of poverty. I think that if you move in this direction, it will actually continue to increase the standard of living for millions and millions of Chinese. So I think it is a very positive development for China. And I have no doubt that the Chinese will, in fact, be successful in this endeavor.
We have to wrap up there. Thank you very much, Anthony. Thank you, Fraser. And thank you, John.
Sure, welcome.
And you've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Joe in Beijing. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.